So 1400 years later, they're writing about Moses. Can we trust it? Be consistent.
We wouldn't be able to trust it unless...
there you go. So
unless
Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, none of them...
They wouldn't be able to unless Moses had previously written things down.
Wait 1 second.
So they're relying on previous writings.
One moment.
They're relying on previous
How many
writings.
books are there in your writings?
This one.
In the New Testament?
27.
27. Every single one of them that talks about Moses and Abraham and David and Solomon and Jacob and Adam, all of them cannot be trusted because they're so far removed from the event.
No. If there's documents they can quote, that's all right.
Wait.
But you can't quote any document to say that Judas died on the cross.
Wait. Excuse me, brother, just one moment. This is very crucial. The Torah was written or given to Moses how long ago, roughly? 1400 BC. 1,400 years ago. Do we have the manuscripts, the writings of the Torah with us? So, what are the earliest writings of the Torah do we have?
We actually have the Dead Sea Scrolls for about 100.
So they are 1,000 years late. So now you have one.
No. Sorry, 1,000 years. More than 1,000. 1,300.
Good. That's what I'm saying. 1,400. 1,300 years late. So you have a document, 1,300 years late, referred to by some of these 27 writers. Can we trust any of these writings which refers to a 1,300-year-old document?
The way we can trust that is to see how much variation happens within a given period.
You are shifting your you're shifting your goalpost. You said the Quran is describing events that happened 500 years earlier. Okay? While the New Testament writings happened within 20, 30, 40, within the first century.
I've made 3 times the same point. They were describing it only because they were already writings. Now, you're describing things for which there are no writings, like Judas dying on the cross.
See, you're now not really taking the point that it has.
I may be incorrect there. Am I incorrect?
It says that Jesus wasn't crucified. It didn't say it was Judas.
Okay, fine. The saying that Jesus wasn't crucified is based on no documents whatsoever.
When the New Testament writers talk anything about the Old Testament prophets, a document 1,300 years later.
Yeah. Do they quote verbatim from the Old Testament or not?
Can you trust their writings?
Do they quote verbatim from the Old Testament or do they have significant variation from the Old Testament?
My question is simple.
Yeah. But
whatever they quote, directly or indirectly, can you trust them?
Well, it depends whether it fits. You see, it fits to the evidence that we have, which is very imperfect anyway.
What evidence?
The Old Testament writings, and basically that's it. That's the only evidence we have.
The Old Testament writing is 1,300 years late in documentation. So,
yeah, but it can't change that.
A New Testament writer writes something which has 1,300 years later. He's saying, you know what? They said this, they said that, and you're saying we can trust it still, depending on if it fits with evidence.
I didn't say that. I mean, my view is not worth anything. But I know that Old Testament scholars currently do not see the books of Exodus, etc., as dating from 1400 anyway. Most of them would see them as dating from around about 500 something.
500 years. So the Quran is 500 years later, according to your estimation, and so is those writings.
Correct.
And yet, the Quran cannot be trusted, but those writings can.
Correct, because they are, one of them is based on former writings, and quoting those former writings.
How do you know that writing is correct?
It is more correct than nothing, for sure.
How do you know that writing is correct? How did you see hieroglyphics in the tombs of the in Egypt, in pyramids and so on, right? They write about history. This pharaoh, Atenkhab, and so on. Akhenaten. Thank you for the pronunciation. Yep. These pharaohs, they have written about them, or people, their scribes have written about them. Is it always 100% true? Writings in this history?
You know, you can't. You're making a massive sweeping generalisation, where in fact you have to go through it piece by piece.
I'm not making any generalisation. I'm taking a particular piece of history, a historical writing in the tombs and the pyramids. Now, just because it's there already, does it mean they're writing the truth? God of the underworld and God of the overworld. Do you believe in the God of the underworld? They wrote about it.
Do I believe in the God of the underworld?
Yeah, that's what they talk about.
Well, look, this is a different language. The word God, I mean, to me the word God just means the one created.
They talk about many gods.
Yeah, but
Do you
the
believe
word,
this is true?
the word God in English can be used for many gods, but on the other hand, there are other words one can use which can only mean one God. So it just depends which language you're speaking in.
Orthodox Jew, they don't know
You see,
personality.
it's very interesting the way every point that you make, you have some way of explaining. The Greek and the Roman pantheons, Isis, Diana, Apollo, Zeus, and so on, right? They have divine powers or special powers, which
special powers.
to us is like watching cartoons, right? Special powers. Do you believe that they truly had those powers?
In Jesus,
I
yes.
don't believe they existed in the first place.
But they are
Right,
the
but the
Jew
writings
who
exist.
lived in Jesus.
the writings
They are the
Of course the writings
Messianic
exist.
Jew.
Good. So just because take me a long time to establish my point. Just because a writing exists from time past, it doesn't mean they're writing what is true. So the New Testament writers, when they talk about and quoting the Old Testament, whatever, it doesn't mean the Old Testament writing is true.
That's correct, but at least it's
So now-
a lot closer
so
to the
now-
event than anything the Quran says about Abraham or Moses.
It's
It's
not about
about
not
2,000
closer.
years.
It's not about, in fact,
Well, no,
when
that is one very, probably the most important aspect.
what
Is
we
that
do know is Moses lived, peace be upon him, 1300 BC.
Yeah.
These writings that we have about him is 1300 years later. They can be written much later, but we know that this writing was written much later. So if Moses lived 1300 years BC and 500 years later someone wrote about them, we have a 500-year gap in the beginning already. And then the writing is even 500 years later. Are you telling me these writings are more credible than a divine revelation which claims to be, this is direct verbatim words of God?
A claim is nothing unless the claim is supported by evidence.
The evidence is given in the Quran that is from God.
What is the evidence? Is it not circular evidence?
The Quran says if it's such a book that you think is not from God, then produce a chapter like it. You should be able to do that if it's not from God. That's what the Quran says. The Quran gives several falsification tests. Your writings should give falsification tests. In fact, it does. In fact, it does.
These are not my writings. I would go for any writings.
Yeah.
I think it's
No,
the
these
best.
writings that you have, in fact, it does. It tells you in one of the manuscripts of Mark, they may be late, that these signs shall follow those
is
who
late,
believe.
yeah. Yeah, that's late.
Those
The,
who believe. And these signs are, if you drink poison, it's not going to harm you.
Yeah. That was added later because Mark's ending was too abrupt.
So I'm saying
Maybe in Islam.
You mean the book was written last?
No, the ending is last. Yeah, the manuscript, the ending is very fast.
The ending may well have been lost. You're quite correct. That's another option. Yeah. Well done. That's quite right. Yeah.
So my point is quite simple. So now you have the Quran giving you falsification tests in plural. One of them is if you think it's not from God, simple. Produce a chapter like the Quran.
There is a website, StoryLikeIt.com, where there are many examples.
Can you tell me how they're like it? I've gone through it
I haven't
myself.
studied them. I don't speak Arabic. It's not my native language.
Get someone who can, and we can go through.
What's the criteria?
The criteria, it has to be like the Quran. The Quran has its own linguistic genre, like every other linguistic literary piece. It has its own writing style. So the Quran has its own writing style.
So has everything else got its own writing style?
Sure. So the Quran has a unique style.
They all have unique style. Many writings in the world have unique style.
Shakespeare, can you imitate it?
I certainly can't, and that proves that the Quran is not saying anything else apart from Shakespeare.
No, some people can imitate Shakespeare's style by writing sonnets.
Who?
There are many examples. I can give you some examples. Search it on my phone and on YouTube.
How have you researched the fact that the imitations of Shakespeare are better than the imitations of the
Who
Quran?
says better? You see, you now.
This is my point.
No,
This
no.
is the criteria.
You see what
It's
you're
the
doing? What you're
criteria.
doing? You haven't even understood the criteria.
As they said,
I didn't say bring anything better. I didn't even. I said bring something like it.
No, better in the sense of being like.
No, bring like it.
Better imitation.
Look. If I say, this is a linguistic piece, a style. 14 words, 14 lines, and each word should begin with a noun rather than a verb, and so on. So I can give you all these characteristics and say, oh, this is what I have to match. The Quran, when it was presented to them, it did not fit to any of the known styles of speech, poetry, prose of the Arabs at that time. The Arabs they have 16 different types of poetry, meters and rhymes,
Why did they have so many?
because that's the collective.
It could be that they had. Oh, you mean 16 genres? You mean?
No, 16 types of poetry. Now I'm just giving you an
Genres of
example of poetry,
Yeah.
where poetry is like al-khafif, Al-Madid, Al-Rajaz, Al-Tawil,
Had
Al-Basit.
these 16 existed from the beginning of time? Or what, did each one have an invention
Not-
point?
these
No,
are
no,
things-
don't change the subject.
I'm not-
Has each one of those got an origin point? Each of these originated at some point.
the way-
The Quran one also originated at some point. Big deal.
I'm answering. The poetry is something that is being transmitted orally and in writing, right? So when the Arabs used to have gatherings or competitions, they will recite these poetries. The best poem, they will hang it on the wall of the Kaaba. They will call it mu'allaqat. So we have these 7 mu'allaqat who became very famous. And even today you can find this English translation by A.J. Arbor. So we have transmissions of these writings, and we can clearly see which particular form of rhymes or meter it falls under. So it will tell you, oh, this is under Rajas, this is under Khafif, and Basit, and Tawil, and so on and so forth. The Quran came, in a way, from a person who they knew was unlettered. That is something important. Who did not learn or study any form of poetry or speech or oration or prose or anything,
How do we know it came from him?
because he's the one who recited. And
Yeah,
he
but that's a
claims...
secular argument.
No.
How do you know he was the one who recited?
We know from historical documentation, just like you know these writings.
Yeah, and when were
came
those historical documentation written down? 150 years later?
150 years. Now I see where the problem is. You have an understanding from debunked revisionist ideas, revisionism, and new revisionism. At one point, we used to believe the Quran was not written until 250 years later. Who said that? John Wansborough, a giant in academia. Guess what? Things have changed. Manuscripts of the Quran have been unearthed, published, discussed,
So what was the
polygraphically dated, radiocarbon dated, that they are from the 1st century of Islam, not 250 years later. So the theory that we have that the Quran was not in existence, it was a product that came gradually and later on, 250 years time period, it is totally outdated and false. Likewise, the idea of the hadith. We have now hadith being unearthed, Sahifa Hammam ibn Munabbih, from the 1st century of Islam, which predates Bukhari's collection. And so on.
So in fact, the situation is extremely similar with Christianity. Our first manuscripts also are within the 1st century, and it seems to me you're trying to make a disjunction between the two that is not valid. Basically, you have an early period where there's no manuscripts, there's documents originating before we've had manuscripts. Then within a few decades, you start getting tiny manuscripts and then larger ones. It's exactly the same with Christianity as it is with Islam.
Absolutely not.
The difference is that Christianity is earlier.
No, absolutely not. I wasn't talking about the New Testament manuscripts, as you can clearly remember. I was talking about the Old Testament manuscripts.
Yeah, you're talking about that.
Old Testament manuscripts. So when it comes to the Quran, the idea that the Hadith, which talks about these kind of things, or biographical literature, no. Quran even tells within itself that they accuse the Prophet of getting it written down in the morning and in the afternoon. And the Quranic manuscripts are dated within the 1st century of Islam. So we have documentary evidence that the Quran was written there, and we have good reasons to believe all of the Quran was present within the 1st century, from historical evidence, from documentary
Well, that's
evidence.
a generalization.
Not generalization.
That people give you, it must be, because it's so short. I would need to read, that's the kind of thing you'd need to demonstrate within a 600 page book.
Look,
now,
let me demonstrate to you that. If you
can't.
go into
There's not enough
Islam,
time.
if you go into IslamicAwareness.org, we have tabulated the documentary evidence of the Quran.
Do non-Muslims agree with this?
You see, brother, one moment. Are non-Muslims any better than Muslims?
Like independent scholars, do they agree?
Yeah, that's a fair criteria.
What we are saying is, Islamic awareness tells you that this is where the work is from academia. We are not inventing.
Which universities? What are the names of the people?
Do you want to know? Yeah. How about from Deroche? Is he an academic? Deroche?
Gerosh.
Deroche.
Deroche.
Deroche. Francois Deroche?
I'm sure you're right. Where's he based?
Where is he based? He's from France, isn't he?
Yeah, I thought he was from France.
Yeah. What about Angelika Neuwirth from Germany?
But you see, this is the very, very beginning of my knowledge.
Do you know the two names I've given? You can go and search. These are the giants.
Are they Muslim?
Of course not. We wish they would be Muslim, inshallah. These are the giants now in the research of Quranic manuscripts. Okay? Islamic awareness, I can pull up the paper and give you, hundreds of references to our articles within each article, where they're from. When it comes to manuscripts, Who studied these manuscripts? Why am I talking about it? Let me just give you an example.
It's fine. I can look it up.
No. Let me give you an example. So at least you know what I'm talking about.
It's the same as anything else. When,
No, it's not
when
the same
anything
as
is
anything.
written,
It's not the same
you
as
know,
anything else.
little
It's
fragments
different.
appear within
It
a
is-
few decades,
if it's-
then longer ones, then longer ones like that. It's not different.
This is different. Okay.
How?
Let me give you an example of a manuscript, right? So from the 1st century of Islam.
I'm not saying there aren't.
Quran manuscript from the 1st century.
Dated by radiocarbon.
If you want radiocarbon dating, I can give you radiocarbon dating.
No, what I mean is that's correct within a certain number of years on each side.
Radiocarbon dating, as you know, gives you a range of dates.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it gives, within the range of dating, it tells you that this is from the 1st century. So you can have calligraphical dating, like Deroche believes in calligraphic dating. He's very conservative. He dates things much later, but still, he believes the Quran is available from the Umayyad times. You know, from 90 or something years. So, like for example, this is Deroche's. He's written something about it. The Paris Petropolitanist Manuscript, right? Codex Parisino Petropolitanus, Quranic manuscript from the 1st century. Now, tabulated. Deroche and Noseda, they published this, where it is found, and these are the references you can find. So Deroche, this is the publication. I'm not going to even pronounce it because I don't know French, right? So this example, Noseda and Deroche, yes, in that one. So you can see where it comes from, scholarly material. Even the scholars themselves, they quote Islamic awareness as a resource. Because what we have done is we've made available public something that wasn't available before. Because people have this misconception that Islam doesn't have any documentary evidence, whether about the Quran or the life of the Prophet or the Hadith. So if you focus on the Quranic manuscripts alone, and you'll see we have documentary evidence going through inscriptions, coins, papyri, palimpsest, and all these writings about the Quranic material. So we can resurrect the Quran, more than 90% of it from the 1st century Islam, from the available documentary evidence.
Very good.
Yeah, but it continues to be unearthed. There are hundreds and hundreds of Quranic manuscripts that are sitting there in the libraries, which needs redating because people thought they were later. Do you know why they're later?
Well, all of them. There's never a single instance where people thought they were earlier.
Exactly, but we have so many compared to
And
your
people
6,000 manuscripts in Greek. We have like 250,000 manuscripts. 250,000. Look at the proportions, and
And
there
there's
are.
the slightest difference for even a letter between them.
When we
Is
talk
that true
about
or not?
manuscripts, when you're talking about manuscripts, of course manuscripts have some errors of transcription and so on and so
Correct.
forth.
So what is the
But-
difference? Is what I can
but
say.
the difference is this. For example, the top copy manuscripts, which is more than 99% complete, it has about maybe 11 scribal mistakes. That's all.
Yeah.
And each one of them I've gone through myself because the work has been done by the scholars themselves, and you can clearly see why the mistake comes. For example, if a letter, if a word is, say, I just want to make a letter up. Say the letter is in English, say idiom. So he writes ID, and he goes to the next line, and he thought he hasn't written D, he writes D again, and writes D.
I know, yeah. One way or two different, yeah.
Exactly, the terms are like this. So all such examples can be demonstrated from this. They are very meticulous. Some of the manuscripts were written by various hands, and they are very sloppy. They make certain mistakes. But the Quran that we have transmitted to us is in two forms, two ways. One is by memorization, meticulous memorization, that if I'm convinced that you have memorized everything by the letter, I give you the permission to teach. So if I now ask you, okay, fine, recite to me the Quran as transmitted to the reading of Hafs, for example, who learned it from his teacher, from the Prophet ﷺ. If you recite it here and now, or go to Indonesia, or anywhere in the world, same recitation. This is how the memorization process has been fixed and stable. Likewise, the manuscript tradition, we go there, you will see within the manuscript tradition is a fixed text. These texts allow us to demonstrate that yes, we can read our readings that we have of the Quran from the manuscripts.
Same applies to the New Testament. There's only a handful of disputed places, and even in there, it doesn't
To
affect
give you an
major
example of Mark's ending.
Mark's ending is not controversial in any way. It's quite clear that the one that is there, 9 to 20, is not original.
Yeah.
The only question is whether 8 is the original ending or not.
Okay. But some scholars will say no, it was part of the original, but it was then taken off.
Name them. There are no leading scholars who would say that. You might be able to name some names of people, but they're not regarded as leading scholars.
I'm not going to quarrel them because it's not my field about who's a leading scholar or not.
Yeah.
Okay?
Well, they wouldn't have been given a job in a top university.
Fair enough. I don't quarrel in that, but I'm saying there are people who have said this.
Of course, there are 7 billion people in the world.
Sure,
They'll be fine
but
something to
the
say.
difference between the transmission of the Quran and the Bible is this. The Bible has been transmitted not through memorization, or not Bible, these writings, not through memorization.
How do you know?
Do you have any evidence of memorization? Who memorized it? Give me some names.
I think the truth is that you're talking about oral cultures, and you cannot say with any degree of confidence that there was not memorization.
Do you have any examples to say, okay, I
the
said
rabbinic
from
cultures were very
New Testament writings. Now I'm moving to New Testament.
If we're talking rabbinic, that has
New Testament.
close links with both Old Testament and New Testament.
Yeah. So in the New Testament
Matthew
writings,
himself is very rabbinic.
so you should now find example from traditions where people memorize the whole of the New Testament writings. Can you find some examples?
They didn't need to because they wrote it down so quickly.
It's not about need to. I'm asking. You see, I made
Well,
a
it is
claim.
very much about that. Why would you do it when you didn't need to?
My assertion was the transmission of these writings and transmission of the Quran followed two different distinct lines. The Quran was transmitted through memorization as well as writing. The Bible, or the New Testament writings rather, was not followed through transmission in terms of memorization.
It may well have been in the
When you
early
say it
years.
may well have been, you need to provide evidence that it had. I'm
agree
going
with
by the available evidence, but there isn't any.
The available evidence actually is that the sayings and doings of Jesus were written down quite early by somebody called Matthew the Apostle, not the same as the author of the Gospel of Matthew. And because he'd written them down, there was no need for memorization because they could just use what he had written.
I'm not questioning whether there's a need or not. I'm
But that's the
simply
essential point. That's the central point, whether there's a need.
asserting whether it actually transmitted this way. If you've memorized something word for word and just make one mistake and you are actually reprimanded for it until you correct your mistake and this mistake is not passed on, then you know that there's a degree of confidence where you know that this piece that is now transmitted to you is been preserved.
The degree of confidence is much higher when something's written down.
But when
if
something
it's not
is
even written down at
but
all.
when but it's to us it's both. But when it comes to the New Testament writings, when
You mean it's written in heaven?
no, Quran was written, I told you Quran was written down in manuscripts, and I give you an example of first century
Oh,
manuscripts.
what you mean that they're memorizing it at the same time it's already written down?
Yes.
Got you.
They were writing and memorization, both.
got
But
you.
New Testament writings, where the writings are there
Yep.
by some unknown authors, doesn't matter in my point here. What
Well,
you
I
have
think
is,
the
what you
vast
have is,
majority of the authors are now.
no, what you have is, if you now compare the manuscript traditions in writing, the Alexandrian tradition compared to Byzantine traditions of writing,
yes.
they're hugely different in terms of their preservation and authenticity. There are differences much more between these two traditions. Which one is more reliable? When you have the GNT or the NAS, you know, what's it
But
called?
there's 30
When you have
I know what you're talking about.
No, when you have
New
the
American
Textus
Standard.
Receptus- No.
Doesn't matter.
When
I know
we're
the
talking
point.
about the Textus critical apparatus, okay?
Yes.
Okay. So you follow which ones? Which are the basis of all this?
It is because you gave the answer yourself. You can tell which one is earliest by doing a family tree according to things like Omoyo to Luton and all the normal ways in which people make mistakes.
So manuscripts are actually examined and say this manuscript is very weak because of so many variants within it.
No, but you find that by detective work you find the reasons for the variance, and that's the way you do
No,
it.
fair enough. But the amount of variance that you have in the New Testament
Will be
transmission-
larger depending on how many manuscripts there are.
Of course, even so, the confidence that you have, again, you come towards an eclectic text where you're saying they sat down together and saying, you know what, A, most probable, B, slightly less than that, A, B, C, D, E.
There are cases where that's the case.
We know that.
But
We know that.
The vast majority of the text that is not the case.
So when we examine the New Testament and we see more than 50% of the text,
No. That is a
under.
crazy.
It's not crazy.
No. You can say more than 50% has variance, but the number of variances are significant.
the new NIV, for example. I'll talk about the NIV.
What are you talking about translations for? Why not talk about the Greek?
No.
The Greek.
NIV
Talk about
is
the Greek.
from the Greek manuscript.
No.
It didn't come from
Translations
nowhere.
are irrelevant.
So which manuscripts?
NIV came in 1977.
Okay. Which manuscripts? No.
NIV was produced through a textual criticism.
So is everything else. But the point is we go
Okay.
back to the Greek. We have the Greek already.
Well, no, there's a problem. Because you've got so many thousands of Greek manuscripts.
Yes, but we have the
Well, no, so many-
we
you've
have
got
the footnotes.
6,000.
We have the footnotes.
No, because you've got so many
Yeah.
Greek manuscripts.
Yeah.
To sift through the Greek manuscripts directly is a very difficult task.
Of course. But people
If
want to
if my discussion is going to continue talking to him, I just have to go and come back later. Chris, my name is Mansur.